Hey class, starting a new video for MMP 310. We're going to cover some new material this time. So if you look in the class notes under week 7, the user interface, we're going to be looking at the DOM library. And we'll keep working with our scene that we've been working on. And we're going to introduce some user controls into the scene. As usual, if you feel like doing something different or starting a new scene, feel free. But the main focus of this is going to be using the DOM elements. We'll be adding a user interface to the scene so it will become interactive. So in the first part, I'm just going to go over a basic example from scratch to kind of show how it works. And then I'll make another video in which I actually add it into the scene that I created in the previous class. And so we'll kind of see how it works in both contexts. So we'll have an assignment around this, which I'll post on Blackboard, and that'll be due next week. Obviously, the schedule is a little up and down right now, so don't be too worried about getting everything. You can kind of take things at your own pace right now, but starting next week, we'll try to kind of have a more regular schedule. And I've talked with some of you guys. I'm going to try to talk with everybody by the end of this week. And then, going forward, I'm kind of considering different ways to communicate. And so I'll talk to you guys about that when I do talk to you individually. And then I'll have some announcements by the end of the week. Just look for that. I'm just going to get started. All right, so to get started, we're going to be looking at this DOM library example. And I have some examples in the class notes as usual. These are interactive examples that you can preview and play around with. I'm going to build this example from scratch just so I can use the inspector in Chrome, and that's going to allow me to kind of point out some of the different ways that this works. So I'll be kind of following this at the beginning, and I might do some slightly different things, and then I'll move into adding this into our scene project. So I'm going to get my project set up first. I'm going to open up GitHub and click Fetch Origin. Or actually, I got to make sure I'm on MMP 310. And then I can go show my files in the Finder. And I can also open in Sublime Text. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the setup today since I covered that in other videos. So I'm just going to get started. So I have a new project. I'm going to call this is just going to be an example. So this isn't a homework assignment. I'm just going to do an example first, and then I'll do the demonstration. So I'm going to call this folder DOM. And so DOM stands for Document Object Model. And it actually has to do with how the JavaScript, HTML, and CSS interact. So I'll talk about that more as we go through. But for this project, I'm actually going to write everything from scratch because we're going to be writing some CSS and HTML for this. So I'm going to just get a copy of the P5 library. So I'll go into one of my other projects and just copy that, and then go back to DOM and paste. And then that'll be good enough for that. And then I'm going to open up index.html on the landing page, so the main index page for MMP 310. And I'm going to add in a new link. So this is a list item, and I'll add an anchor tag. And the reference goes to DOM, D-O-M. And I'll just put here DOM example. And then close the anchor tag and close the list item. And so if I want to see this working, and so if I want to see this project, I'll just go to Tools and start the Sublime server. And we can actually see down here that the Sublime server started. So I'll go back to the browser and go to localhost 8080. And so then we can see MMP 310 in the Sublime server. And we see the link to my new DOM example. And so I haven't added files in here yet. So obviously we've got to do that to get this to start working. So as we build our files, let's talk a bit about what the DOM is. All right, so let's take a look. So the DOM library used to be a separate library. Now it's a default part of P5. And what it actually lets us do is it lets us add HTML elements from our JavaScript file. So this is using the document object model. This is basically a concept of how a web page works. So if we click on the DOM here, so you guys have probably gone over this in different classes that you've been in, but essentially any website is made up of three parts, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's actually look at one of our other projects as an example. So I'll just do the characters project. So if we look at the files we have for this project, we have our HTML file. That has some basic structure, so what we need on the page. And for our projects, that's not a lot. Like we have the title of the page, which shows up here. We have a link to the style sheet, and then we have some links to our JavaScript. So on a typical HTML page, you might have some like headers or some paragraphs or things like that. But in our projects, we don't have a lot of content because we're really mostly rendering graphics. So the HTML part of the DOM, I'm going to put this over here. So HTML is the content of the page. Then we have style.css. And again, we don't have a lot here because for our project, basically we're just getting rid of the margins on the body and making it so you can't scroll. But typically you'd have more rules in here. And so the CSS is for styling. Okay, and then what we really have a lot of is JavaScript. So we have much more functionality. So JavaScript is for, I might run out of space here, functionality. And the document object model is basically what lets us communicate between the three different documents. So if we want to use our CSS to style our HTML, then we have to use selectors in the CSS. So we select, here's the body. Okay, so the body is selecting this element in our HTML document. And in JavaScript, we're doing the same thing. So like in our JS file, when we say create canvas down here, that's actually building a canvas inside of our HTML page. So we don't see it over here because that's the original document, but you can see it here is the canvas in our HTML page. So that's basically what the DOM does, is it kind of creates this idea of what's in a website so that our three different languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, can communicate with each other. So what we're going to do today is we're going to use JavaScript to create HTML elements and interact with the HTML and CSS in order to make a user interface for our project. So I'm going to go back to the DOM example. And so let's start out just by creating our HTML and CSS. So I'm going to close our main page here and then go to DOM. And so I don't have any files in here yet. I'm going to hit Command N and then save as. So this is DOM and this is index.html. And since we are going to be making some HTML, I figured we might as well review it a little bit. So an HTML document always starts with doc type HTML. That just tells the browser what kind of document we're looking for. And then we have our main HTML node, which contains the rest of our HTML document. And so everything else goes in between that opening HTML tag and the closing HTML tag. Inside the document, we have our two main sections, the head section and the body section. Of course, this is review. And inside these sections, we have different types of content. So the head section has some basic links to other parts of the page and some meta information. The body has like our main content. So for the head section, I'm just going to add the title. This is the DOM example. And we always have the meta character set equals UTF-8. This is one that we, don't always. This is one that we always add because it's a required standard. It basically just tells us how many characters to load in order to display, the alphabet and numbers and stuff like that. And then finally, we're going to link to the style sheet. So we'll say link href. Is style.css, and the rel is style sheet, and the type is text/css. So that's everything that we're probably going to need in our head section. Let's move on to the body section. So here we're not going to add much content here, although we could. One way that you could, there's a lot of different ways to approach this. Like we could write some HTML and then we could reference it in the JavaScript. Since we're mostly working in JavaScript in this class, what we're going to learn how to do is create HTML and create CSS styles from JavaScript. So we're, again, not going to have a lot of HTML here. We're just going to have a script with a source to load p5.min.js. I'll close that. And then I'm going to have another script, and the source is sketch.js. And we'll close that as well. So kind of ended up with the same thing, but just wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about HTML. And then since we're linking to style.css, let's create that. So I'm going to make a new one. And again, I'm just going to get rid of the margins in the body. So I'm going to save this as style.css. And the reason I'm doing that, if we reload this page now, we should actually see something. If we look at the body, there's this kind of like default margin that happens on the top and the bottom. And then if there was some content there, you'd see it on the right and left as well. And so that prevents us from making our canvas take up the whole HTML page, which looks a little bit better. So you don't have to do it that way, but it's just a nice way to make our project take up the whole screen. So we're going to say the margin is 0, and that will get rid of that red margin there. And then to make sure that sometimes if the canvas is off by like a pixel or two, you'll see a scroll bar. That doesn't really look great, so we're just going to say overflow is hidden here to prevent that. So again, simple style sheet, simple HTML. Most of what we're going to actually be doing with the CSS and the HTML is in our JavaScript file. So I'm going to create a new file and save as. This is, as usual, sketch.js. And I'll start, as I often do, with a little comment up here and say, this is our DOM example. This is March 24th, 2020. And so we'll go from here. So we're going to do our function setup as usual. And then here we're going to say create canvas. And so create canvas is actually kind of a DOM function. It creates a canvas on the page. So we're going to do window width by window height, as we have been doing with most of our examples. And that's just going to create this canvas right here. And you can see the width matches the width of the window, and the height matches the height of the window. So these variables and this function, they're all kind of examples of how the DOM works. Like in our JavaScript, in order to make our program fill the whole canvas, we need to actually know, how big is the browser. So if I resize the browser a bit, you can see that canvas is no longer big enough. But if I refresh it and it loads it again, now we can say it's updated the width as well as the height to match what we have in the browser. And so that's a nice example of how the DOM works. It kind of lets us communicate between the HTML page, the browser, and what we're doing with our code. So we've got our canvas, which is the size of our window. And then let's just add in our draw loop. And I'm just going to add a background color. I'll do maybe a nice plum color. And so now we can actually see where our canvas is. It's the plum area. And then I'm just going to do a really simple loop like we've been doing in our previous classes. So I'm just going to make a little pattern in order to like have something that we can use for the demonstration. So it's going to be kind of similar to our scene, but simplified. In our scene, we have a bunch of different loops to display different components like the birds, the clouds, or actually, sorry, not birds, fish, clouds, trees, etc. And so I'm just going to use a loop to show that. And I will just make kind of a little pattern. So I'm going to say for let I equals 0, and I'm just going to make maybe 10 circles, I++, and I'll just kind of draw an ellipse. I'll choose some random numbers, so let's say let x equals I times 100, so it'll kind of move across the screen, and then maybe we'll just add a little randomness to that, so it won't be always the same. And then let's say y, let y equal, let's just do anywhere, so we can say random height for that one. And then for the size, let's say let s for size, let's just do random. Let's say the smallest one is going to be 100, and the biggest one is going to be 200. And so then I'll draw an ellipse, x, y, and size. And let's do a fill as well, so it's not the same color as the background. So let's say fill is gold. And now we can see that we're getting this like kind of crazy animation. And that's because it's like redrawing, and I'm using a lot of randomness. So it's just kind of like, you know, redrawing these random values over and over again. We don't really have that problem in our scene because we're saving all those as objects. But just for this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take draw, and I'm going to replace that with a different function name, pattern. And I'm just going to call pattern in setup. And so that way I'll only have one pattern at a time. And let me also just call no stroke, just to kind of simplify how that looks. So I have to put the no stroke obviously before the pattern, so that looks better. And so that'll make it a little bit easier to do our demo here. And so the couple things that we want to do, we're going to add a couple different HTML elements to the page that kind of allow our user to interact with the page. You might remember from MMP 210 that we actually made buttons using P5 code. We did a couple different examples. One is we had like a little circle, and then we would detect, you know, if the mouse was right here, we would detect the distance between the mouse in the middle of the circle and use that as a button. We also did like a rectangle where we detected if the mouse was inside the rectangle or, you know, outside the rectangle. So that's actually great. You know, you can make your own buttons using JavaScript and build your own interface, but because you know, HTML already has elements like sliders and buttons, it's kind of a lot easier just to use those elements, and we can also use CSS to style them to kind of fit the design of our site. So we're going to see examples of how to do that. So I'm going to first start with a button that actually is going to generate a new pattern when we click it, so we don't have to refresh the page. And that one's going to be really simple because we have pattern as a function here. So that's going to be kind of our most simple example. We're going to see more complex examples as we go. So let's do that first. So I'm just going to say, after this is going to be in setup. So with the DOM stuff, we actually do more stuff in the setup function, because when we create a button in HTML, we don't want to like keep creating it over and over again, and we don't have to draw it the way we do our pattern or our graphics in our other examples. So we're just going to create it once, and then HTML will keep it there. It's actually not part of the canvas that we're using. So I'm going to do that by creating a button. I'm going to say variable button is, and this function is create button. So that probably looks familiar, right? We have create button, just like we have create canvas. So I'm going to create a button, and the button just takes one parameter or argument, which is what we want the button to actually say. So we can put a string there. So for this one, I'm gonna say generate pattern. And so that way the user knows what's gonna happen when they click the button. And so this by itself is actually gonna create that button. We'll see it in our HTML down here, but notice you don't actually see it in the page because our canvas is taking up the whole page, and so our button is down here. And so that kind of brings us to how do we get this button on the page? And we actually need to use CSS to do that. Because the button itself, you can see our canvas is here. That's what contains all our graphics. The button is actually part of the HTML page. So if we want to style it, we need to use style. And there's actually a nice CSS function for that, or JavaScript function for that. We can say just button.position, and then we can use positioning like we would in the canvas. So if I wanted to put this button, let's put it in the top left up here. I could just put the button at 50x and 50y. And now we see it up here. So it doesn't actually do anything yet, but the nice thing about an HTML button is that it reacts to clicks. We don't have to program that. So we have the button, and here, this is where you can kind of choose to do different things, because I can use JavaScript to style the button, but in some ways it's actually much easier to write CSS. So if I give this button a CSS rule, then it will still apply to the button here. So I've got the button. You can see that my position function set the position of the button. So there's the left and the top. But if I go into CSS and I just use a generic button rule, I can actually change the style of the button here. So for example, we might want the button to fit our design a bit more. So maybe instead of the kind of rounded corners and black and white text, I can make it so it fits what we're doing. So let's try giving it a wider border. So I'll say border is maybe like 2 pixels solid. And I can try using gold. As long as it's not like directly over that, it may look good. Okay, we're gonna need to make it a lot bigger to stand out. So I'll try 4 pixels. Okay, that looks good. Let's add a radius. So I'll say border radius is, let's say 3 pixels. Okay, we need it to be a lot bigger. So let's say the border is 10 pixels and the border radius is 5 pixels. Okay, maybe that was a little overboard. Let's say 6. Okay, and let's give it some padding. So let's say the padding is 10 pixels. Okay, that's starting to look a little better. Let's set the background color. So we can set the background color to be plum to match our design. Okay, and then let's set the color of the text. We'll set that to gold. Okay, and let's make the font bigger. Font size is, let's say, let's try 30 pixels. Okay, so that's nice and big. That's maybe a little too big. Let's try like 18. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It's starting to actually match our design a little bit, but now the interaction doesn't work. So let's also set button hover states and button active states. So you guys may not have done this recently because we don't do a ton of CSS in this class. So hover is just when the mouse goes over, and then active is when we click. So let's like reverse the colors when we hover over. So we'll say the background color is gold and the color of the font is plum. So when we hover, we'll see that. That looks kind of nice. And then when we're active, what should we do? Oh, and we also want to make sure the button, I don't know why it doesn't turn into a pointer, but we can set that. We can say cursor is pointer. Okay, and then let's set an active state. So when we click on it, what could we do? We could just reverse the colors again. Look good. Border color is plum. Let's say background color and border color are plum. No, then it's just blank. So then I guess the color of the text has to be gold. we can go with that for now. Okay, so we have one button. Let's put it a little bit closer to the top left. So we can do that again in sketch.js. So let's put it at like 10 and 10. Okay, so we have our generate pattern. So we have a button, it kind of looks right. Now let's actually make it work. So what we'll do is connect that button to our pattern function. And in our JavaScript, that's actually really easy. So I'll just say button, and then I'll say mouse pressed. Okay, so that's kind of like function mouse pressed, but now it's connected to our button. And then we'll just put the function that we want to call in there. Okay, so the pattern function is what we want to call here. So it gets called once when we do the setup so we can see something. And then when we press the button, it'll recall it, so it'll redraw our pattern. Okay, so now we have a user interface. Instead of having to reload the page to change our pattern, our user can actually just click this button. Okay, so next, let's give the user the ability to download the image. So that's another pretty easy one. So I'll create another button. I'll say var button is, or actually we have to change the name here. So let's say save button is create button save image. And so this one, we're gonna have to position it a little bit farther over. So maybe about 100. Whoops. Whoops, I needed to make sure this is the same button. Okay, so we need to move it over a bit further. 200. Okay, that's good. It could actually be more like 180. Okay, that looks good. So you can move that around. And so now what we can do for save image is we can actually just write a function for that. So the pattern function goes into button. So then for the save image function, let's just write a new function. So I'll say function save image. And P5 actually has a built-in function to save an image, which is save. And we just have to add an argument. So let's call this pattern. And then if we say .png, that will make it download a PNG. So I'm going to save that. So we can generate the pattern until we get something we like, and then click save image. Okay, let's try that again. I did a hard refresh. If I click save image. Oh, you know what? I haven't actually added it. So we want to connect that function. So I'll say save button dot mouse pressed. And then we'll just put the save image function in there. Okay, so now we saved an image. And you can actually do anything you want with this code. Like we could have a button to draw a different pattern. We could have a button to change the color. And so we can add different elements to kind of do whatever we want. So the next thing we're going to do is add a slider so we can actually change some of the components of the drawing. One thing that we're going to have to do with the slider is that if we want to change how this drawing is set up, we're going to need to actually like change some of these numbers. So for example, if we want a slider to determine the number of circles in our pattern, we can change this number into a variable. So let's just call this num circles. And we can put that in the global scope so that it's accessible in both of our, in our setup function and our pattern function. So I'll put this up here in the global scope, var num circles. I had it at 10. So now this num circles, that 10 is going to go in there. So right now it'll look the same. But what we can do is add a slider, and then our user will be able to change the number of circles and generate a new pattern. So let's add in our slider. So we'll say variable slider. And this one is create slider. This one is a little more complicated than the button because there's more variability. So let's take a look at the documentation. So under DOM, we can scroll down and look at create slider. And so this is what a slider looks like. Okay, this one is changing the color. This one is changing the color in a different color mode. And so for a slider, we need the minimum value, the maximum value, the value to start at, and then this optional one for how much to move each time. So we'll just go with the first three. We could add this step if we want to, but the default is going to be 1. So if we're okay with 1, we don't have to worry about that. So for our slider, the minimum value for circles, let's say that since we're creating a pattern, we don't want there to be like 0 circles. So let's say the minimum value is like 5. And then the max value, we could do, something really big. Like we could do 1,000. That might be too big. We'll see. So again, the first argument is the minimum value, then the maximum value, and then the num circles is actually where we start. So we might as well have our slider start at num circles. Okay, so that'll actually create the slider. It's not going to work yet because we need to write some code to make it work, but it will be on the page. So there's our input. Type is range. That's what makes the slider. So let's move it into view so we can change the position first. So I'll say slider.position. And let's put it below the generate pattern. So we'll use the same X and then a higher Y value, 10 and 50. Okay, we need to put it a little bit lower. And a little bit lower. And then another thing is that it's not really clear what the slider is, so we might want to put a label there. I think there's a thing to do that. Let's check the reference. Okay, so there's no create label, but we could use just the regular generic create element, which will let us create any HTML element we want. And we don't actually need to make this a variable because we don't need to, well, actually we are going to have to set the position. So let's say var label is create element, and this will let us create any HTML element that we want to, including a button or an input. But since we don't have a label, we can just do this. So we'll create a label, and then we'll give it what we want the text to be. So we'll say update the update circles, and I'll put a little colon there. And let's say label.position is, we'll do that at 1080, and then we'll move the X on the slider over a bit. Oh, I got an error. I misspelled label here, so let's just put that in there. Okay, and our label is not styled, so we'll have to do that as well, and we need to move the slider over more. And a bit more. Okay, so let's style our label. I'm just going to see if I can kind of piggyback on the button. Well, actually, I don't want to add all of that stuff, so let's just add some of it. So let's say label, and let's just change the color, font size. I think that's all we need to do. And I guess they're different fonts. It's kind of weird. Okay, so let's say font is sans serif. Oops, this should be font family. Okay, so that looks a little better. Let's move the slider over a bit more. Okay, so now we can update our circles. So let's actually connect that code. So let's go back to our slider. And so we need a function to do this because we need to actually put a function in the slider. So we'll say slider, and then you can't mouse press a slider because you're always changing it. So let's just call this input. Well, actually, that's just so we'll use the input event. So anytime any input, and then we'll just update. I'll just make up a function called update circle number. And so then we can put our function here, say function update circle number. It's kind of a long function name. I could probably do something smaller. But then in there, we can just get the value from the slider. So we'll change our number circles variable, num circles, equals slider.value. And we actually have to use the parentheses at the end there to get the value. And so then after we do that, let's also generate the pattern right there so we don't have to go back and click the button. So we'll change the number of circles, but then we'll also automatically generate a new pattern, which will run this code for us with the new number of circles. So now, whoops. Oh, I got an error here because I tried to reference slider, but slider is not defined because I made the variable inside the setup function. So there's two ways that I can fix that. One is quick. I can just change slider to this. This is a keyword that's going to refer to whatever element this slider is attached to. So that should work, yes. Although I don't see, there should definitely be more circles. So let's debug that in a second. The other way I could fix this is I could just declare my slider in the global scope. And so that way the slider, it'll know the slider is in setup as well as in the update circle number function. So let's console.log that value to make sure we're getting the right number. Okay, it is a large number. So why isn't it changing my number of circles? So I'm going to delete this. And let's see, console.log num circles. Oh, I see what the issue is. I'm increasing x by 100 each time. So it really doesn't matter how many circles there are because most of them are like over here because x just keeps going up. So instead of 100, what we're going to have to do is figure out if we want to go across the page. This number is going to have to be relative to the width of the page. So let's change that number to num circles divided by width. That'll give us a relatively smaller number, which will divide the page by the number of circles. Okay, so, wow, that's way too many. 1,000 is way too many circles. You know what? I did this backwards. I want to divide the width by the number of circles. There we go. Okay, so there's 1,000 is obviously way too many, and 5 is okay as a minimum. So let's change this minimum value. Let's just say 100. But now we can see our pattern changing. So it's not that exciting, but you know, we can get different patterns. We can control the amount of circles in the pattern, and then if we like something, we can click to save it. So that's a basic simple user interface. That's going to be it for this part. In the next video, I'll introduce adding the user interface to our scene example. So kind of cover a lot of the same stuff, but using some code that we've already written.